"You're coming with me," he said. The words were not a question, not an offer, but a statement of fact, as solid and unyielding as the granite bluffs that cut across the horizon. The dust of the dry road clung to everything, a fine red powder coating the cracked leather of his boots, the flanks of his steady horse, and the pale, exposed skin of the woman who stood shivering in the brutal afternoon sun. 3 men, her late husband's kin, stood near their wagon, their faces a mixture of smug satisfaction and scorn. They had done their work, a final, public act of dispossession, stripping her not only of her home and her name, but of her dignity itself, leaving her with nothing on the border of a stranger's land. The oldest of them, a man with a hard, pinched face and eyes like chips of flint, spat into the dirt. "She's grace and property, owed to us. You've no business here." Abel's gaze did not waver from the woman. He saw the tremor in her shoulders, the way she stared at a point in the far distance, refusing to meet the eyes of her tormentors or her rescuer. He swung down from his horse in a single fluid motion, his movements economical and deliberate. He untied the thick wool blanket from behind his saddle and walked toward her, the space between them charged with a silence that drowned out the wind. He didn't speak again as he wrapped the heavy fabric around her, his hands careful not to touch her skin, the gesture one of profound, impersonal respect. He then turned to face the men, his expression unchanged, as placid and formidable as a winter lake. "Get off my land." The journey back was a silent procession against a vast, indifferent sky. The woman, Lena, sat huddled in front of him on the saddle, the coarse wool of the blanket a rough comfort against her skin. She could feel the solid wall of his chest at her back, a steady, unthreatening presence that asked for nothing. She focused on the rhythm of the horse's gait, the creak of the leather, the soft thud of hooves on the parched earth. Each step took her further from the life that had been dismantled piece by piece and then shattered in a final, cruel gesture. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. Abel rode with a stillness that seemed to be a part of the landscape itself, his eyes scanning the rolling hills and shadowed canyons with an ingrained vigilance. He did not speak, did not offer platitudes or ask questions that she had no answers for. His silence was a refuge, a space where she could begin to gather the scattered fragments of herself without the pressure of explanation or performance. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western clouds in brutal strokes of orange and crimson, the colors of a fresh wound. The light caught the sharp lines of his face, revealing a map of sun and hardship etched around his eyes. He was a man made of the same unforgiving material as the land he worked, yet there was a quiet integrity in his posture, a promise of safety that she hadn't felt in years. As the first stars pricked the deepening twilight, the faint glimmer of a single lantern appeared in the distance, a tiny spark of warmth in the immense, gathering dark. It was the first sign of a destination, a place she was being taken to, not a place she had chosen, and the fear, cold and sharp, briefly returned. His ranch was nestled in a small, protected valley, a collection of sturdy, unadorned buildings that looked as if they had grown from the earth itself. A modest house, a solid barn, and a web of fences stood against the encroaching wilderness, a testament to relentless effort and quiet endurance. He led the horse to a trough, slid from the saddle, and then reached up for her. His hands were calloused and sure as they circled her waist, lifting her down to the ground. For a moment her legs would not hold, and he steadied her without a word, his grip firm until she found her balance. Inside, the house was sparse and clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. The furniture was handmade, worn smooth with use. There was a faint scent of wood smoke, coffee, and old leather. He pointed to a closed door. "That room is yours. There are clothes on the bed." "They were my mother's." He moved to the stove, his actions practical, his focus already on the next necessary task. He lit a fire, the crackle and flare of the kindling filling the quiet room with a sudden, welcome life. Lena went into the room and saw a simple cotton dress and a worn shift laid out on the quilt of a narrow bed. They were clean and smelled of lye soap and sunshine. She shed the heavy blanket, the last remnant of her humiliation, and dressed in the borrowed clothes. They hung loosely on her frame, but they were a shield, a beginning. When she emerged, he had 2 plates of beans and bacon on the simple wooden table. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of forks on tin plates and the soft sigh of the fire. She watched him, this quiet, severe man who had intervened with the force of a natural law. He ate with the same focused intention he applied to everything, his gaze directed at his plate. He asked nothing of her, not even her name. It was a mercy she hadn't known she needed. The first days passed in a slow, silent rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. Abel rose before dawn, the soft thud of his boots on the floorboards the only alarm clock. He would be gone for hours, tending to his few cattle, mending fences, existing in a state of constant, purposeful motion. He left food for her on the table, a piece of bread, a bowl of stew, without ceremony. He did not intrude on her solitude, did not knock on her door. He gave her space as if it were a physical commodity, a balm for a wound he could not see but knew was there. Lena remained within the walls of the house, a pale ghost haunting the edges of his life. She explored the small space, her bare feet silent on the cool plank floors. The house was a reflection of the man, everything had a purpose, nothing was superfluous. In the room she had claimed, she found a small wooden box containing a few cherished items, a set of whittled birds, a faded photograph of a stern-looking woman with Abel's eyes, and a single, chipped porcelain teacup, its delicate handle broken off. She held the fragile cup in her hands, its uselessness a strange comfort. It was broken, like her, but it was still beautiful. One afternoon, driven by a need for air that felt thick and close, she stepped onto the porch. The sun was bright, the air sharp and clean. In the distance, she could see Abel, a solitary figure repairing a section of fence line, the rhythmic strike of his hammer a steady heartbeat against the vast silence. He did not turn or wave, but she saw his movements slow for a fraction of a second, a minute hesitation that told her he knew she was there, watching. It was the first time she had willingly stepped out to meet the world, and he had granted her the dignity of not making it a spectacle. A week after her arrival, she saw it. A dark speck on the distant eastern ridge, a place where no rider should be. It was too far to make out details, but she knew, with a cold certainty that settled deep in her bones, who it was. The Graysons. They were watching. The figure remained for nearly an hour, a silent, malevolent sentinel, before finally disappearing back over the rise. A shiver, unrelated to the day's warmth, traced a path down her spine. The valley no longer felt like a sanctuary, but a cage. She retreated back into the house, the walls suddenly feeling thin and fragile. That evening, Abel came in from his chores and did not immediately start dinner. Instead, he laid a worn piece of oilcloth on the table and carefully began to disassemble his rifle. He worked under the quiet hiss of the lantern, his large hands moving with unpracticed, unnerving grace. He cleaned each piece methodically, the metallic scrape and click of the components echoing in the small room. He did not speak of the rider on the ridge, did not acknowledge the threat that now hung in the air between them, but his actions were a conversation in themselves. Lena sat in a chair by the hearth, watching him, her hands clenched in her lap. The methodical cleaning of the weapon was not an act of aggression, but one of sober preparation. It was an acknowledgement of the world outside their quiet valley, a world that had not forgotten her. She understood then that his protection was not a momentary act of charity, it was a responsibility he had shouldered, and he would not set it down lightly. The air grew thick with unspoken understanding, a shared knowledge of the danger that lay waiting just beyond the horizon. One night, the sharp, distressed bleating of a ewe woke the homestead. A storm was moving in from the north, the wind moaning around the corners of the house. Abel was already pulling on his boots, grabbing a lantern as he headed for the door. Driven by an instinct she didn't understand, Lena followed him out into the churning darkness. In the small birthing pen near the barn, a ewe was struggling, a lamb breech and barely breathing. The wind whipped at them, threatening to extinguish the lantern's fragile flame. Abel worked with a calm, focused urgency, his hands gentle but firm as he tried to reposition the lamb. "Hold this," he commanded, his voice tight, gesturing with his head toward the lantern. Keep the light steady. Lena took it, her hand surprisingly firm as she held the warm glass, angling the beam so he could see. She knelt in the dirt and straw, the wind tearing at her hair,